What are binary genders?
Binary genders are the social normative genders that we think of when we think of the word gender: female, male, the either-or spectrum of gender.
What is the gender spectrum?
The gender spectrum is a phrase that people use to describe pretty much where everyone fits, whether male, female, or something in between or outside those two identities. It's slightly different from the idea of sex, which is the biological sex organs that you're born with. The gender spectrum covers all identities. Most of our society uses a binary gender spectrum of just male and female, but a lot of our society is beginning to come to terms with the fact that the gender spectrum is much more than just 2 points on a line.
What is the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation?
Sexual orientation is a term that describes who a person's attracted to. It's a term that we use to describe whether someone is heterosexual, they're attracted to the opposite sex or the opposite gender, and homosexual, where they're attracted to the same sex or same gender, and bisexual, where they're attracted to both. And there are other terms that we use besides just those three. The gender identity is a phrase that we use to describe how a person identifies themselves on the gender spectrum, whether they identify as a male or whether they identify as a female or as a transgendered person, a transsexual person, an intersexed person. A gender rebel, which is generally someone who desires not to identify themselves in any specific label.
What is the difference between transgender and transsexual?
Transgender and transsexual are two terms that are often used interchangeably by our society, but they're two terms that mean two very different things. A transsexual is someone who identifies as a gender that's different than the biological sex they were born with. These are people like Chaz Bono, who was born with the biological sex of a woman and is now undergoing a physical transition to become male because he's always felt male and that's been his gender identity. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity does not match their biological sex. This can include transsexuals, but it's not limited to just transsexuals. It includes any person who feels that their gender identity is different than a biological sex. All transsexuals are transgender, but not all transgenders are transsexual.
What does cisgender mean, and how is this different from gender assigned at birth?
Cisgender is a term that defines any person who has a gender identity that matches up with their biological sex. A cisgender person is someone who is also capable of fulfilling the societal gender roles that they're assigned with that gender identity and biological sex. A typical cisgendered woman would be a young girl who plays with dolls, helps her mom in the kitchen, wears dresses and has long hair. A typical cisgender male would be a boy who plays catch with his dad, wears jeans all the time, gets in fights, gets dirty, that sort of thing.
What does coming out mean?
Coming out is a term that's used societally to describe a person who is identifying different than their biological sex or their assigned gender role and has decided to be open about that identity.
What are some more popular personal labels that you know of?
A lot of popular personal labels are used day to day in every society. Things like male, female for gender identity, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual for sexual orientation, transgender, transsexual, intersexed, two-spirit. There are people with a gender identity who choose not to use labels and therefore label themselves as gender rebels or gender outlaws.
Do you feel that, at some point, breaking everything down into separate labels can blur defining lines too much?
I think you absolutely run into an issue with that. We use labels as human beings to define people because it's how our mind works. We need a word that defines a concept or an identity or an object. It's how our brain remembers what these objects and identities are. But you do run into a problem when everyone has a different label to describe themselves. Yes, it's really, really good that everyone has this label, but at the same time, you then run into this very polarizing situation where everyone is so very different because of the labels that they use to describe themselves or that society uses to describe them, that we then run into an issue where we focus on our differences much more than our similarities.
Many people claim to refuse the use of labels, stating that they only drive us further apart. So what good are labels anyway?
Labels do often drive us further apart. I think that's a very valid criticism of labels. Labels also help us identify ourselves to society, and especially important, identify ourselves to ourselves. When we're growing up and we're learning and we're changing and we're discovering who we are, it's very, very difficult to discover that you're not this ideal cisgender person that society's told you need to be. And it's very, very hard to grow up understanding that and to define yourself and identify yourself as something different from that. And when we have labels like transsexual, transgender, homosexual, bisexual, we have a positive identification of what we are, rather than just a negative identification that we're not this, we're not that. And we need those positive identifications to help ourselves become happy, content, mature, prideful individuals.